Throughout history, humanity has witnessed moments so terrifying, so unexplainable, that they seem to belong more to nightmares than to reality. From disasters that wiped out entire civilizations, to mysterious explosions and man-made horrors that left the world frozen in fear. These are the moments that changed history forever. In today's video, we'll count down the top 5 scariest events in human history. Real stories that prove sometimes the truth is far scarier than fiction. Number 5. The Tunguska Explosion of 1908. It was a calm morning, June 30th, 1908, deep in the frozen wilderness of Siberia. The sun had just begun to rise above the endless taiga, and villagers near the Podkamenia Tunguska River were starting their day. Then, without warning, the sky erupted. A blinding ball of fire streaked across the heavens, glowing brighter than the sun itself. People hundreds of kilometers away said the sky split in two. Moments later came the explosion. A deafening roar echoed through the valleys, followed by a shockwave that flattened everything in its path. In seconds, over 2,000 square kilometers of forest were destroyed, an area larger than any modern city. 80 million trees lay crushed, pointing outward from a single invisible center. Herds of reindeer vanished, birds fell silent, and a searing wind turned night into a storm of flame and dust. One man, Seaman Shakaran, a local hunter, recalled being thrown from his chair miles away as the blast's heat burned his skin. His home shook violently. The sky, he said, was on fire. Others thought the world was ending. Yet when scientists arrived 19 years later, led by Russian explorer Leonid Kulik, they expected to find a massive crater. But there was none. The trees were flattened, the ground was scorched, but the earth itself was untouched. There was no meteorite, no evidence of an impact. It was as if something exploded in the atmosphere and then disappeared. Experts have long debated what happened. Some believe it was a giant meteor or comet that exploded about 10 kilometers above the ground, releasing energy equivalent to 15 megatons of TNT, more powerful than the largest nuclear bomb ever tested. Others suggest something far stranger, theories of a black hole, an alien craft, or even a secret weapon tested before its time. In the days that followed, reports came in from as far away as London. The night skies across Europe glowed a strange silver blue, so bright that people could read newspapers at midnight. No one understood why. Even today, over a century later, scientists continue to study the Tunguska site. Satellite images still show that eerie circular scar in the forest, a silent witness to one of the most powerful and unexplained explosions in Earth's history. And what makes it so terrifying is that it could happen again, anywhere, at any time, without warning. That is why the Tunguska Explosion of 1908 stands as the 5th scariest event in human history. Number 4. The eruption of Mount Tambora, 1815. The year was 1815, and on the remote Indonesian island of Sumbawa, an enormous volcano named Mount Tambora stood silently, as it had for centuries. But deep beneath the mountain, something was stirring. A pressure building for centuries, waiting for a single moment to change history. It began quietly in early April. Locals reported distant rumbles, like thunder from the ground itself. The air grew thick with ash, and animals fled into the forests. Then, on the night of April 10, 1815, the earth roared. The explosion was so violent that it shattered eardrums of people over 40 kilometers away. A column of fire and smoke rose more than 40 kilometers into the sky, higher than any storm cloud on Earth. Lightning flashed through the ash. The ground shook violently, and within hours, entire villages around the volcano were buried under a rain of molten rock and volcanic dust. Survivors described it as if the world was ending. The sky turned black, even at noon. For 3 days, the island was swallowed in total darkness. When the eruption finally subsided, more than 10,000 people had died instantly. But that was only the beginning. The eruption of Mount Tambora released 160 cubic kilometers of volcanic material into the atmosphere, the largest eruption in human history. The ash cloud rose so high that it spread across the entire planet, blocking sunlight for months. By the following year, 1816, the world experienced what became known as the Year Without a Summer. Across Europe, North America, and Asia, The sun dimmed behind a strange veil of dust. Snow fell in June. Crops failed across continents. Rivers froze in the middle of summer. People starved. In China, rice crops were destroyed by frost. In Ireland, famine spread through villages. In the United States, temperatures dropped so low that entire harvests failed, driving thousands into poverty and hunger. It is estimated that over 100,000 people died globally from famine and disease that followed. The strange climate that year even inspired dark creativity. In a cold, stormy villa in Switzerland, a young woman named Mary Shelley was trapped indoors by the eerie weather. Out of that darkness, she wrote a story that captured the mood of the world. A tale of death, fear, and rebirth. That story became Frankenstein. Mount Tambora had changed the earth and the human imagination forever. When the ash finally settled years later, the once mighty volcano had collapsed into itself, leaving behind a crater 7 kilometers wide and 1,200 meters deep, a wound in the earth that still exists today. It stands as a silent reminder that the very ground beneath our feet holds unimaginable power, and that when nature decides to unleash it, the consequences can plunge the entire world into darkness. That is why the eruption of Mount Tambora in 1815 remains the fourth scariest event in human history. A time when the sun vanished, the skies burned, and the world nearly froze. Number 3, the Spanish flu pandemic of 1918. The world had just begun to recover from the horrors of the First World War. Millions had perished on the battlefield, and entire nations were in ruins. But as soldiers returned home, they carried something with them, something far deadlier than bullets. It started in the spring of 1918 in a U.S. Army camp in Kansas. Soldiers began to fall ill with high fevers, chills, and fatigue. At first, doctors believed it was just a seasonal flu. But within weeks, the sickness spread. Not just through the camp, but across oceans, aboard ships filled with returning troops. Within months, it had reached every continent on Earth. The virus was ruthless. It struck fast and without mercy. Victims would wake up healthy in the morning and be dead by nightfall. Their faces turned blue from lack of oxygen, and many drowned in their own lungs. In some towns, entire families were wiped out within days. Hospitals overflowed. Streets were filled with bodies. Coffins ran out, and people were forced to bury loved ones in mass graves. Fear spread faster than the disease itself. Schools, theaters, and churches were closed. In some cities, people wore makeshift masks made from cloth and gauze, though no one knew if they worked. And unlike most flu viruses, this one didn't spare the strong. It killed the young, the healthy, the soldiers, those in the prime of their lives. That was what made it so terrifying. By the end of 1918, 1/3 of the world's population, around 500 million people, had been infected. At least 50 million died, though some historians believe the true number was closer to 100 million. It was the deadliest pandemic in modern history, killing more people in 1 year than the entire First World War had in 4. Entire communities disappeared. The silence in once bustling cities was described as unnatural. Horses dragged carts full of bodies through the streets. Newspapers printed lists of the dead that filled entire pages. And yet, even as it ravaged the world, people didn't fully understand what it was. The virus was invisible, no microscope of the time could even see it. Doctors fought blindly against an enemy they couldn't name. By 1920, the pandemic had finally burned itself out. But it left the world changed. It taught humanity how fragile life could be, how quickly everything could vanish without a single shot fired or a building falling. The Spanish flu of 1918 remains one of the scariest events in human history, not because of destruction or explosions, but because of how silently it spread, how deeply it struck, and how helpless it made the world feel. A disease that turned fear into silence, and silence into death. Number 2, the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, 1945. The year was 1945. After 6 years of brutal fighting, World War II was reaching its end. Nazi Germany had surrendered in May, but Japan continued to fight fiercely. Cities lay in ruins, millions were dead, and across the Pacific, the United States prepared to make a decision that would forever change the course of history. For years, scientists had been working in secrecy under a program called the Manhattan Project, a mission to develop a weapon unlike anything the world had ever seen. It was a fusion of science, fear, and desperation, born from the belief that if they didn't create it first, the enemy would. On the morning of August 6, 1945, at exactly 8:15 a.m., a B-29 bomber named Enola Gay flew over the quiet Japanese city of Hiroshima. The sky was clear. People were heading to work. Children were walking to school, unaware that a new kind of death hovered above them. Then, a single bomb, nicknamed Little Boy, was released. It fell for 43 seconds before detonating 600 meters above the city. In an instant, a blinding flash brighter than the sun illuminated the sky. The temperature at the center of the blast soared to over 4,000 degrees Celsius, hot enough to melt steel and turn concrete to dust. Within seconds, the city vanished. Everything within 2 kilometers of the center was destroyed. People standing directly below the blast were vaporized, leaving behind only shadows burned into walls, a silent imprint of where life had once stood. The explosion released the energy of 15,000 tons of TNT. The shockwave flattened buildings, fires raged through what remained, and radioactive ash rained from the sky. Hiroshima had become a living inferno. In the following hours, the city was a nightmare. Survivors, their skin burned and hanging in ribbons, wandered through the ruins in silence. Rivers were filled with bodies. Parents searched for children who would never answer. The air was thick with smoke, dust, and death. By the end of that day, over 70,000 people were gone. Tens of thousands more would die in the weeks that followed from radiation poisoning. A new kind of suffering humanity had never known. But the horror didn't end there. Just 3 days later, on August 9, 1945, another American bomber flew toward the city of Nagasaki. The bomb, codenamed Fat Man, was dropped at 11:02 a.m. Nagasaki's valleys and hills absorbed some of the impact, but the destruction was still unimaginable. Another 40,000 people were killed instantly. Tens of thousands more succumbed to burns, injuries, and radiation in the following months. The sky turned orange. Buildings burned like paper. Survivors described the blast as a second sun rising from the earth. In the days that followed, the world stood in stunned silence. News of the destruction spread quickly. Photos of cities turned to wastelands, of people scarred beyond recognition, of life erased in seconds. On August 15, 1945, Japan finally surrendered. World War II was over, but the cost was beyond comprehension. The bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki were not just military strikes. They were humanity's first encounter with its own power to destroy itself. The fear that followed, the dread of nuclear annihilation, has haunted the world ever since. Even decades later, survivors known as hibakusha still carry the scars, both visible and invisible, of radiation, trauma, and memory. And while those 2 bombs ended one war, they began another, the Cold War, a silent standoff built on the fear that one day humanity might press that button again. The atomic bombings remain one of the scariest events in all of human history, not only for what they did, but for what they proved, that mankind has the power to end everything it has ever built, in the blink of an eye. We've witnessed the power of the atom, the wrath of volcanoes, and the silent killers that moved unseen through our world. But now, we arrive at the top of the list. The most horrifying, most devastating, and most unforgettable event in all of human history. A time when death ruled the earth, when entire cities vanished, and hope itself began to die. This is number 1, the Black Death. It began in the year 1347, a time when Europe was alive with trade, art, and exploration. Ships crossed the Mediterranean carrying goods, silk, and spices from the east. Towns bustled with merchants, laughter, and life. But aboard one ship from the port of Kaffa was something else. Something small, silent, and unseen. Rats. And upon their backs, the fleas that carried Yersinia pestis, the bacteria that would soon erase nearly half of Europe. In October of 1347, a fleet of Genoese ships docked in Messina, Sicily. People rushed to greet them, unaware that they were welcoming death itself. The sailors staggered ashore, feverish, covered in black, swollen lumps, buboes that oozed blood and pus. Within days, the sickness spread through the city like wildfire. It moved swiftly, carried by trade routes, ships, and travelers. From Sicily to Italy, from Italy to France, from France to England and beyond. By the start of 1348, it had conquered Europe. The symptoms were terrifying. It began with chills and fever, then excruciating pain as black boils formed under the arms and groin. Victims vomited blood and collapsed. Few lived beyond 3 days. The stench of death filled the air. No one knew what caused it. People said it was punishment from God. Others blamed bad air, the miasma, or even foreigners and the poor. In panic, people turned against each other. Families abandoned their sick. Priests fled their churches. Mothers left children crying in empty houses. In Florence, chronicler Giovanni Boccaccio wrote that fathers refused to visit their sons. One brother abandoned another. In Paris, 800 people died every single day. In London, carts rolled through the streets carrying heaps of bodies to mass graves. The horror was unimaginable. There were not enough priests to bless the dead, not enough coffins to bury them. Bells tolled endlessly, until there was no one left to ring them. By 1349, the plague had reached its peak. In some towns, 9 out of 10 people were gone. The dead were everywhere, in homes, in fields, on the roadside. Dogs and rats fed on the corpses. Entire villages vanished. The countryside fell silent. Some people turned to faith, marching through cities whipping themselves in repentance, hoping God would forgive humanity. Others turned to sin, drinking, gambling, and celebrating, believing the end had come. But the plague spared no one. Kings, peasants, merchants, and monks all fell the same way. It spread beyond Europe, across Asia, North Africa, and the Middle East, leaving a trail of silence and ruin. Historians estimate that 75 to 200 million people died between 1347 and 1351. A number so vast it's almost impossible to comprehend. In England, the population fell from 5 million to barely 2 million. In France, nearly half of the people perished. And when it was over, nothing was the same. Labor was scarce. The economy collapsed. Old hierarchies crumbled. And the survivors, those few who lived, were left with a haunting truth, that death had walked among them, and no one had been safe. Centuries later, science would discover the true cause, the bacterium carried by fleas on rats. But at the time, the people believed the apocalypse had come. The Black Death remains the most terrifying event in human history, not just because of how many it killed, but because of the darkness it left behind. It changed how we see life, death, and the fragility of everything we build. For 4 long years, humanity stood on the edge of extinction. And though the world moved on, the shadow of the plague still lingers in our memory. A reminder that even the mightiest civilizations can fall to something too small to see. That was the Black Death, the top and most horrifying event in all of human history. From the mysterious blast that shattered the Siberian skies, to the volcano that dimmed the sun and froze the earth, from wars that scorched nations to the plague that brought humanity to its knees. Each of these moments wasn't just terrifying, they were transformative. They revealed how fragile our world truly is, how easily life can change in a single heartbeat, and how, through every horror, humanity still finds a way to rise. But perhaps the scariest part of history is knowing that it can always repeat itself, because the past isn't gone. It breathes through us, in our fears, our choices, our future. This has been Historical_Happenings, uncovering the moments that changed our world, and the nightmares that still echo through time. If you enjoyed this journey into the darker side of history, please subscribe, like, and share this video, so together, we can keep exploring the untold stories that shaped our world.